Welcome, kind listener, to this peaceful haven of history. This is a place where stories flow like a gentle river, carrying us far away from the rush of the present. Whether you are lying in bed, eyes growing heavy, or sitting quietly as the evening settles, know that you are among friends here. If you'd like, share in the comments where you are listening from. I treasure the chance to see how history brings together people from every corner of the world. And if these calm journeys speak to you, go ahead and subscribe, so our paths may cross again in the chapters to come. But for now, let the noise of today drift away, and join me as we wander softly into the mists of the past. Close your eyes, if you wish, and let yourself drift backward through time, past the centuries and millennia, to an age when the world was young and wild, when the boundaries between earth and sky were still being drawn, when gods walked upon mountains that touched the clouds and giants strode across valleys that had not yet known the footsteps of humankind. This is a story that the ancient Greeks told around fires on cold nights, that they whispered to their children as the stars wheeled overhead, that they carved into temple walls and sang in verses that have echoed down through the ages to reach us here, in this quiet moment we share together. The war between the gods and the giants was not a simple tale of good against evil, though it has sometimes been told that way. It was something far more complex, far more human in its motivations, despite involving beings of such tremendous power that their battles shook the very foundations of the earth. It was a war about order and chaos, about the old world giving way to the new, about fathers and sons and the eternal struggle between generations. It was about power, yes, but also about justice, about destiny, about the painful birth of the world as the Greeks understood it. To understand why gods and giants went to war, we must first understand where they came from, and to do that, we must go back to the very beginning, to a time before time, when there was nothing at all, or perhaps, when there was everything, all mixed together in a state of such perfect chaos that nothing could be distinguished from anything else. The Greeks called this primordial state chaos, but we should not imagine disorder as we understand it. Chaos was not a mess, not a jumble of things in disarray. It was something far stranger. It was the void, the gap, the yawning emptiness that contained within itself the potential for all things. It was the blank canvas before the first brushstroke, the silence before the first note of music. From this chaos, slowly, inevitably, like cream rising or sediment settling, the first beings emerged. They were not created by any conscious will, for there was no consciousness yet to do the creating. They simply came into existence because existence required them, because the universe needed foundations upon which to build itself. The first of these was Gaia, the earth herself, broad-breasted and eternal, the ground beneath all things, the mother of all life. Imagine her if you can, not as a woman with a human face, though the Greeks would sometimes depict her that way, but as something far vaster and more fundamental. She was the soil and the stone, the mountains and the meadows, every grain of sand on every shore, every pebble in every stream. She was the solid reality of the world, patient and enduring, strong enough to bear the weight of all that would come after. And from Gaia came Uranus, the sky, who stretched himself above her like a great dome of deepest blue, studded with stars that were perhaps the first lights to pierce the darkness of chaos. Some versions say that Gaia brought forth Uranus from her own substance, that she dreamed him into being because she was lonely in her vastness and desired a companion, someone to match her in power and extent. And so the earth and sky became the first couple, the first union of opposites, the first marriage in all of existence. Their embrace was the space between ground and heaven, and in that space, all life would eventually flourish. But before there could be life as we know it, before there could be flowers and trees, birds and beasts, men and women, there had to be the Titans. These were the children of Gaia and Uranus, and they were beings of immense power, each one embodying some fundamental force of nature. There was Oceanus, the great river that encircled the entire world, and Tethys, the goddess of fresh water who was his wife. There was Hyperion, who shone with the light that would later become the sun, and Thea, who gleamed with the light of heaven. There was Ceus, the axis of heaven around which the stars revolved, and Phoebe, the bright one whose light was gentler than her brothers, like moonlight on water. And there were others, 12 in all, but the youngest would prove to be the most important. His name was Cronus, and he was clever and ambitious in ways his siblings were not. He looked at the world his parents had made and saw not wonder but opportunity. He looked at his father Uranus and saw not a god to be honored but an obstacle to be overcome. And when the time came, he would act on those thoughts in a way that would change everything, that would set in motion the very conflicts we are exploring tonight, the wars between the generations of gods that would eventually draw in the giants themselves. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, moving too quickly for a story that should unfold slowly, like petals opening to the morning sun. Let us return to those early days, when the Titans were still unborn, still waiting in the darkness for their chance to enter the world. You see, Uranus was afraid. He could feel his children growing within Gaia's womb, could sense their power, and he understood with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to those who rule that these children might one day challenge him, might one day take from him the supremacy he enjoyed over all creation. And so he made a decision that was as cruel as it was practical. He refused to allow his children to be born. Imagine Gaia's suffering, if you can. Picture her body stretched and aching with the weight of her unborn children, 12 Titans growing larger and stronger within her, pushing against the walls of their confinement, desperate to see the light, to breathe the air, to take their place in the world. Years passed, then centuries, and still Uranus would not relent, would not allow his wife to deliver their children. The earth herself groaned with the pain of it. Mountains trembled. The seas, which had only recently been formed, churned and frothed as Gaia's agony rippled through them. At last, Gaia could bear it no longer. In her desperation and pain, she conceived a plan, not a gentle plan, not a plan of reconciliation or compromise, but a plan of violence and revenge. She reached into her own substance and drew forth a piece of the hardest flint, the sharpest stone, and from it she fashioned a great curved blade, a sickle of such keenness that it could cut through anything, even the flesh of an immortal god. Then she called out to her unborn children, her voice echoing in the darkness where they waited, and she asked which of them would help her, which of them had the courage to act against their father. Most of the Titans were afraid. They had never known anything but the darkness of their mother's womb, had never seen their father except as a distant, overwhelming presence. But Cronus was different. Cronus was bold, or perhaps we should say Cronus was ruthless in a way that his more timid siblings were not. He took the sickle his mother offered, and he waited. He waited in the darkness with the patience of stone, with the certainty of one who knows that his moment will come. And come it did. When Uranus descended to embrace Gaia, as he did each night, spreading himself across her in the way of the sky covering the earth, Cronus emerged from his hiding place. In one swift, terrible motion, he swung the flint sickle and castrated his father, severing the source of Uranus's creative power in a spray of divine blood that fell upon Gaia's body and into the foam-topped waves of the sea. Uranus's scream of agony echoed across all creation, a sound that would never be forgotten, that would ring in the memory of the cosmos forever. He pulled away from Gaia, drawing himself up into the heights of the sky, away from the earth he had loved, and from that day forward, the sky and the earth were separated, no longer joined in constant embrace. The blood that fell from Uranus's wound did not simply disappear. In the Greek understanding of the world, nothing was ever truly destroyed, everything transformed into something else, energy and substance constantly shifting forms. Where the drops of blood struck Gaia's body, they gave birth to new beings. The Furies emerged, terrible goddesses of vengeance with snakes for hair and eyes that wept blood, creatures whose sole purpose was to punish those who committed crimes against family and the natural order. They were born from violence and would be agents of violence, hunting down wrongdoers with implacable determination. The giants, too, were born from this blood, or at least some of them, for the mythology is not always clear or consistent, and stories told by different Greeks in different times sometimes contradicted each other. But many accounts say that the giants sprang from the earth where Uranus's blood fertilized the soil, making them quite literally the children of heaven and earth, born of violence and betrayal. And from the severed member itself, cast into the sea where it floated on the foam, came something unexpected, something beautiful. Aphrodite, the goddess of love and desire, emerged from the waves fully grown, stepping onto the shore of Cyprus with the grace of dawn breaking over calm waters. The Greeks understood the deep connection between violence and beauty, between destruction and creation, between the ending of one thing and the beginning of another. From the most terrible act of violence came the goddess of the sweetest pleasure, and in this paradox, they saw something true about the nature of the world. With Uranus wounded and withdrawn, Cronus and his siblings finally emerged from their long imprisonment. They took their places in the world, and Cronus, by virtue of his courage or his ruthlessness, perhaps both, became the ruler of this first generation of gods. The age of Cronus is often called the Golden Age, a time of peace and plenty, when the earth brought forth fruit without labor, when humans, who appeared during this era, though the myths are vague about exactly how, lived simple, happy lives without war or want, when death came gently, like falling asleep after a satisfying day. But the Golden Age carried within it the seeds of its own ending, as Golden Ages always do. You see, when Cronus had castrated his father, Uranus had cursed him with his dying breath, or not dying, exactly, for gods do not die in the way mortals do, but with his last words as a power in the world. Uranus prophesied that Cronus, too, would be overthrown by his own son, just as he had overthrown his father. And Cronus heard this curse, and he believed it, and it poisoned his reign with fear. When Cronus married his sister Rhea, and we should not be surprised by siblings marrying in these early generations, for who else was there to marry, and besides, the gods operated by different rules than mortals. He watched her pregnancies with growing dread. As each child was born, beautiful and perfect, glowing with divine power, Cronus did not see a son or daughter to love and nurture. He saw a threat, a potential usurper, the agent of his prophesied downfall. And so he devised a solution that was in its own way as terrible as what he had done to his father. As each child was born, first Hestia, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon, he snatched them from Rhea's arms and swallowed them whole. Now, these were immortal beings, so they did not die in his belly. They simply existed there in darkness, unable to grow or develop, trapped in an eternal infancy, aware but helpless. Rhea's grief at losing each child was profound, but she was powerless against her husband, who was after all the king of all creation at that time. With each pregnancy, she hoped that somehow this child would escape the fate of its siblings, and with each birth, she experienced anew the horror of watching Cronus gulp down her baby as casually as a man might swallow a grape. By the time she became pregnant for the 6th time, Rhea had reached her breaking point. She could not, would not, lose another child to her husband's paranoid hunger. She sought counsel from her mother Gaia, who remembered her own suffering at the hands of Uranus and was more than willing to help her daughter thwart Cronus. Together they devised a plan that was simple but required careful execution. When Rhea felt her labor beginning, she fled to the island of Crete, to a hidden cave on Mount Dicte where the darkness was thick enough to hide in and the stone walls would muffle any sound. There, attended only by her mother and certain nymphs who could be trusted to keep a secret, she gave birth to a son. She named him Zeus, which means bright or sky, and from the first moment of his life, he was marked for greatness. The circumstances of his birth, hidden, secret, protected by deception, would shape his character. He would grow to be a god of many faces, a master of disguise and strategy, someone who understood that sometimes the indirect path was wiser than the direct assault. The nymphs took charge of the infant Zeus, nursing him on the milk of the goat Amalthea and feeding him honey from the sacred bees of Crete. And to cover the sound of his crying, which might have reached even to the distant halls where Cronus ruled, young warriors called the Curetes danced around the cave, clashing their bronze shields and spears together, creating such a din that no baby's wail could be heard over it. It was a strange lullaby, the crash of bronze on bronze, the thunder of stamping feet, the wild ululation of the dancers, but it kept Zeus safe. Meanwhile, Rhea returned to her husband, and when Cronus demanded to see the child, she presented him with a large stone wrapped in swaddling clothes. Cronus, in his arrogance or perhaps in his haste to be done with this unpleasant business, did not look closely. He took the bundle and swallowed it whole, just as he had swallowed his other children. The stone settled into his belly alongside his imprisoned sons and daughters, and Cronus believed himself safe once more from the prophecy that haunted him. But Zeus was alive, growing in secret on Crete, nursed by nymphs and protected by the Curetes. The years passed, though time moved differently for gods than for mortals, and we cannot say exactly how long, and Zeus grew from infant to child to youth to a young god of tremendous power and, even more importantly, of tremendous intelligence and cunning. He learned many things in his hidden cave and in the mountains of Crete. He learned patience, for he had to wait until the time was right. He learned secrecy, for his very existence had to be concealed. And he learned to think strategically, to plan several moves ahead like a player of some cosmic game. When Zeus was grown and strong, he emerged from hiding and began to put into motion a plan that would change the order of the cosmos. He did not immediately challenge his father to single combat, that would have been foolish, for Cronus was still powerful, still the ruler of all creation. Instead, Zeus used guile. He took on a disguise, appearing as a humble cupbearer, and gained access to his father's presence. He carried with him a special potion, given to him by Metis, the Titaness of wisdom and deep thought, who would later become Zeus's first wife. This potion was a powerful emetic, and Zeus mixed it into the wine he served his father. Cronus drank deeply, suspecting nothing, and immediately the potion began to work. He felt his stomach convulse, felt an irresistible urge to vomit, and he could not stop it. First he regurgitated the stone he had swallowed last, which would later be set up at Delphi as a monument to Zeus's victory. Then came Poseidon, then Hades, then Hera, then Demeter, then Hestia, all the children he had swallowed, emerging now fully grown, divine, powerful, and absolutely furious at their father for the years they had spent imprisoned in darkness. The 6 siblings stood together, glowing with divine power, and they understood immediately that their brother Zeus had freed them, that he was offering them a chance at revenge against the father who had wronged them so terribly. Cronus, weakened by the potion and shocked by the sudden appearance of his children, rallied his fellow Titans to his defense. Not all the Titans supported him. Some, like Metis and Themis, sided with Zeus from the beginning, understanding that the future belonged to this new generation. But most of the Titans, whether out of loyalty to their brother or fear of the unknown, or simply because they preferred the world as it was to the uncertainty of change, chose to fight for Cronus. And so began the Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans and the Olympians, the old gods and the new. This was a war that would last for 10 years, though again, divine time is not mortal time, and we should perhaps understand 10 years as meaning a very long time rather than a precise measurement. It was a war that shook the very foundations of creation, that threatened to unmake the world and return it to the primal chaos from which it had emerged. Imagine, if you can, the scale of this conflict. These were not human armies clashing on a plain somewhere, not swords and spears and shields wielded by men of flesh and blood. These were gods, beings of tremendous power who could reshape landscapes with a gesture, who could call down lightning or summon earthquakes or turn the sea into a weapon. When Zeus threw his thunderbolts, forged for him in the depths of the earth by the Cyclopes, whom he had freed from their own imprisonment, the sky split open with light and the thunder rolled across the world like the drumbeat of doom. When Poseidon struck his trident against the ground, the earth shook and cracked, opening great chasms that swallowed armies. When the Titans fought back, hurling mountains at their enemies, the geography of the world was altered, new mountain ranges thrust up, new valleys carved out. The battlefield was Mount Othrys, where the Titans had their stronghold, and Mount Olympus, where Zeus and his siblings established their base. These two mountains faced each other across a vast plain, and for 10 years the fighting raged back and forth across the contested ground. The sky was dark with smoke and ash, the air thick with the smell of ozone from Zeus's lightning. Rivers boiled away to nothing from the heat of battle, forests burned, and the sea itself seemed to rage in sympathy with the conflict, sending great waves crashing against the shores as if trying to wash away the combatants. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage, for the Titans were experienced and powerful, primordial forces who had ruled for an age, while the Olympians were young and vigorous, innovative and desperate. The war might have gone on forever, might have destroyed the world entirely in its fury, but Zeus remembered something his grandmother Gaia had told him, a secret about potential allies who could tip the balance. Deep in the darkest pit of the underworld, in a place called Tartarus that was as far below the earth as the sky is above it, certain beings had been imprisoned since the very beginning of time. The Cyclopes were there, not the race of one-eyed monsters that would later appear in various myths, but 3 specific individuals, sons of Gaia and Uranus, who had been cast into Tartarus by their father because their appearance disturbed him. They were master craftsmen, able to forge wonders from metal and stone, and they had languished in darkness for ages beyond counting. Even deeper in Tartarus were the hundred-handed ones, 3 brothers named Codus, Briareus, and Gyges, who each had 50 heads and 100 arms. They were beings of such immense power that even the Titans feared them, which is why Cronus had kept them imprisoned even after he overthrew his father. They were rage and violence personified, capable of hurling 100 boulders simultaneously, of fighting with the fury of 100 warriors while possessing the strength of gods. Zeus descended into Tartarus, into that place of eternal darkness and suffering, and he found these ancient prisoners. He spoke to them of freedom, of revenge, of the chance to fight against those who had imprisoned them. He offered them honor and a place in the new order he intended to create, if only they would help him defeat the Titans. The Cyclopes agreed immediately, grateful beyond measure to this young god who showed them kindness when they had known only cruelty. They forged for Zeus his thunderbolts, weapons of such power that they could split mountains and set the sky ablaze. For Poseidon they made a trident that could shake the very foundations of the earth. For Hades they crafted a helmet of invisibility that would allow him to move unseen through any battlefield. The hundred-handed ones were more cautious, for they had been betrayed before and had learned to trust no one. But Zeus persisted, speaking to them of justice and rightness, of the need for the old order to give way to the new, and eventually they agreed to join him. When they emerged from Tartarus and joined the battle, the tide immediately turned. Picture them if you can, 3 giants, each with 50 heads that saw in every direction at once, with 100 arms that could hurl boulders the size of houses. They stood on the battlefield and rained down stone upon the Titans, creating a storm of rock that darkened the sky and shook the earth. The Cyclopes' weapons gave Zeus and his siblings tremendous advantages. Zeus's lightning was so bright it blinded those who looked at it, so hot it set the air itself on fire. Poseidon's trident could split the ground open, creating chasms that swallowed Titan armies. Hades' helmet allowed him to move invisibly behind enemy lines, striking without warning, spreading confusion and fear. But it was the hundred-handed ones who truly broke the Titans' power, overwhelming them with sheer volume of violence, with the relentless barrage of stone and fury that could not be withstood. The final battle was apocalyptic. The sky itself seemed to be tearing apart, lightning cracking it like breaking glass. The earth heaved and buckled, great chunks of it breaking off and falling into the abyss. The seas boiled and steamed, the water turning to vapor from the heat of the conflict. The very air seemed to burn, and the noise, imagine the noise, the thunder of Zeus's weapons, the crash of boulders hitting the ground, the war cries of gods, the screaming of the Titans as they realized they were beaten, was so loud that it could be heard at the very edge of creation, where chaos still waited to reclaim what had been taken from it. And then, suddenly, it was over. The Titans broke. They fled, but there was nowhere to run. Zeus and his allies pursued them across the battlefield and captured them one by one. The defeated Titans were cast into Tartarus, into that pit of eternal darkness that had held the Cyclopes and the Hundred-Handed Ones. But Zeus, having learned from his father's mistake, did not simply imprison them and forget about them. He set the Hundred-Handed Ones as guards, ensuring that the Titans could never escape, could never threaten his new order. There they would remain, in the darkness below the world, for all eternity, or at least, for as long as Zeus's reign would last. Not all the Titans were imprisoned. Some, like Oceanus, had remained neutral in the war and were allowed to keep their positions. Others, like Metis and Themis, who had sided with Zeus, were honored and given places of respect in the new order. But Cronus himself, the former king of creation, was bound in the deepest part of Tartarus, where he still dreams, perhaps, of the golden age he once ruled, before his son overthrew him just as the prophecy had foretold. With the Titans defeated, Zeus and his brothers divided the cosmos among themselves. They drew lots to determine who would rule which realm, and fate assigned Zeus the sky and the upper air, making him king of the gods. To Poseidon went the seas and all the waters of the earth, while Hades received the underworld and dominion over the dead. The earth itself and Mount Olympus were to be shared by all, neutral ground where any god could walk. Zeus established his court on Mount Olympus, that highest of mountains whose peak was so tall it pierced the clouds and touched the realm of the upper air. The gods built palaces there, magnificent structures of gold and marble that gleamed in the sunlight, halls worthy of immortal rulers. Zeus took his place as king, wielding his thunderbolt as a scepter of office, and around him gathered his siblings and the children who would be born to them, the second generation of Olympians who would become the gods the Greeks worshipped, Athena and Apollo, Artemis and Aphrodite, Ares and Hephaestus, Hermes and Dionysus, and many others. But victory in the Titanomachy did not bring peace. Gaia, the earth herself, was displeased with the new order Zeus had established. Her Titan children were imprisoned in darkness, suffering for the crime of losing a war, and she felt that Zeus's punishment was too harsh, his justice too severe. Remember that Gaia had helped Zeus, had advised him, had conspired with Rhea to save him from Cronus. But now she turned against him, feeling betrayed, feeling that he had become as cruel as his grandfather Uranus, imprisoning his defeated enemies in the same eternal darkness that had once held his own father. In her anger and grief, Gaia coupled with Tartarus itself, not the place but the primordial god of that place, the darkness given form and consciousness. From this union she bore a final son, a monster so terrible that even the gods would tremble before him. His name was Typhon, and he was the ultimate challenge to Zeus's authority, the most dangerous opponent the king of gods would ever face. Typhon was, how can we describe him? The ancient poets struggled to find words adequate to convey his horror. He was enormous, so large that his head brushed the stars while his feet remained planted on the earth. His arms, when extended, reached from the eastern horizon to the western, spanning the entire width of the world. Instead of fingers, serpents writhed from his hands, each one venomous and deadly. His legs were not legs but massive coils like those of a viper, and they propelled him forward with terrifying speed. But most terrible of all were his heads, for Typhon had not one head but hundreds, dragon heads that sprouted from his shoulders and neck, each one breathing fire, each one speaking in a different voice. Some roared like lions, others barked like dogs, still others hissed like serpents or bellowed like bulls or trumpeted like elephants. The cacophony of his voices was enough to drive mortals mad, and the fire from his mouth set everything he passed ablaze. When Typhon rose from the earth and began his march toward Olympus, the gods were terrified. Many of them fled, transforming themselves into animals and hiding in Egypt, which is why Egyptian gods have animal forms, some Greeks would later claim, because the Olympians hid there and influenced the local worship. But Zeus did not flee. He could not flee, for he was the king, and if he abandoned his throne, then everything he had fought for, everything he had sacrificed to achieve, would be lost. He stood alone on Mount Olympus and prepared to face the monster his grandmother had sent to destroy him. The battle between Zeus and Typhon was even more devastating than the war against the Titans. They fought across the entire Mediterranean world, from Greece to Syria and back again. Zeus hurled his thunderbolts, those weapons forged by the Cyclopes that had never failed him, but Typhon's hide was so thick and his body so many that the lightning, though it burned and wounded him, could not bring him down. The monster retaliated with blasts of fire from his many mouths, and the air between them became a furnace, so hot that the sea itself began to boil where the heat touched it. They grappled hand to hand, god and monster locked in combat, each trying to force the other down. Typhon's strength was immense, born of the earth itself and the primal darkness of Tartarus, and for a terrible moment it seemed he might actually win. He wrapped his serpent coils around Zeus and began to squeeze, crushing the life from the king of gods. With his many hands he tore the sinews from Zeus's arms and legs, leaving the god helpless, paralyzed, unable to wield his weapons or even to move. Typhon carried the crippled Zeus to a cave in Cilicia and left him there, guarded by a serpent while the monster went to complete his conquest of Olympus. But Hermes and Pan, two gods who had not fled with the others, came to Zeus's rescue. They recovered his stolen sinews and restored them to his body, healing his wounds and returning his strength. Zeus emerged from the cave, his power restored, burning with divine fury at the indignity he had suffered. The final confrontation took place in a region that would later be called Campania, in what is now southern Italy. Zeus pursued Typhon relentlessly, driving him westward, striking him again and again with lightning until the monster's strength began to fail, until his many voices became hoarse with pain and exhaustion, until the fire from his mouth sputtered and dimmed. At last, Zeus managed to lift the entire island of Sicily. Some versions say he lifted it, others that he hurled it, and cast it down upon Typhon, pinning the monster beneath millions of tons of rock. Typhon did not die, for like all divine beings he was essentially immortal, but he was trapped, imprisoned under the weight of that island. His breath still escapes through Mount Etna, the Greeks said, which is why that volcano still erupts, still sends forth fire and smoke and rivers of molten stone. His struggles beneath the earth cause the earthquakes that occasionally shake Sicily and southern Italy. Even in defeat, Typhon's power is felt, a reminder that chaos and primal fury are never fully conquered, only contained, always threatening to break free. With Typhon defeated and imprisoned, Zeus's rule was finally secure. He had overcome the challenge from the old order of Titans, and he had overcome the challenge from the primal chaos that preceded even the Titans. He had proven himself the strongest, the wisest, the most fit to rule. The other gods returned from their hiding places, shamefaced but ready to acknowledge Zeus's supremacy, and the order of Olympus was established in the form it would maintain for as long as the Greeks worshipped these gods. But the war between gods and giants was not finished, not yet. The conflict we have traced so far, the overthrow of Uranus by Cronus, the overthrow of Cronus by Zeus, the defeat of Typhon, these were all preludes to what the Greeks called the Gigantomachy, the great war between the Olympian gods and the giants, the actual conflict that our title speaks of, the eternal war that defines the tension between order and chaos, between civilization and wildness, between the world as we know it and the world that existed before. The giants, as we mentioned earlier, were born from the blood of Uranus when Cronus castrated him. They were the brothers of the Furies and, in a sense, the uncles of the Titans, which made them cousins to the Olympians, though more distant in relationship. They were huge beings, though not quite as large as Typhon, strong and fierce, associated with the wild places of the earth, the mountains and forests where human civilization had not yet penetrated. Some accounts say they had serpents for legs, coiling masses of scales where their feet should be, marking them as creatures of the earth, chthonic beings who belonged to the old order, to the primordial world that existed before Zeus's rule. For a time after Zeus's victory over the Titans and Typhon, the giants remained quiet. They had their own realm, their own way of life, and they did not immediately challenge the new order. But Gaia had not forgotten her grievances. Her Titan children were imprisoned in Tartarus, and now her youngest son Typhon was pinned beneath Sicily, trapped and suffering. She looked upon Zeus and his Olympians with growing resentment, seeing them as usurpers who had taken power that did not belong to them, who had established an order that was too rigid, too controlled, too removed from the wild fertility and chaotic creativity that she represented. So Gaia went to her giant children and roused them to war. She whispered to them of their imprisoned siblings, of the injustices of Zeus's rule, of the glory that awaited them if they could overthrow the Olympians and establish a new order more in keeping with the ancient ways. And the giants listened, for they were violent beings by nature, sons of bloodshed and betrayal, and the prospect of war appealed to them. They began to gather, to arm themselves, to prepare for an assault on Olympus itself. The gathering of the giants was a terrifying sight. They came from every corner of the earth, striding across mountains and valleys, each one as tall as a tower, armed with weapons befitting their size, tree trunks torn from the ground and used as clubs, boulders the size of houses to hurl at their enemies, spears as long as masts. Their leader was Alcyoneus, who was not only huge and strong but also immortal as long as he fought on his native soil. Others included Porphyrion, who was almost as powerful as Alcyoneus, and Enceladus, who breathed fire like a dragon, and Polybotes, who pursued Poseidon across the sea, and many others whose names have come down to us in fragments of ancient poetry. The giants marched on Olympus, and the gods prepared to defend their home. But there was a problem, a prophecy that complicated everything. It had been foretold that the giants could not be killed by the gods alone. Divine power, no matter how great, was insufficient to permanently defeat these children of heaven's blood and earth's body. For a giant to truly die, it had to be slain by both a god and a mortal working together. The immortal and the mortal, the divine and the human, had to unite their strength to overcome these creatures who embodied the primal power of the earth itself. Zeus, hearing this prophecy, knew he needed to find a mortal champion, someone with the strength and courage to fight alongside gods against opponents who dwarfed even the mightiest human warriors. And he knew exactly who that mortal should be: Heracles, the greatest hero ever born, the son Zeus himself had fathered with the mortal woman Alcmene. Heracles was half divine, possessing strength that surpassed any ordinary human, a warrior who had already completed labors that proved his exceptional nature. He was the perfect bridge between mortal and immortal, the one being who could fulfill the prophecy's requirement. So the gods prepared for war, and they summoned Heracles to Olympus to fight beside them. The hero came willingly, honored to stand with his divine father and the other gods, ready to prove himself once more in the greatest battle of the age. He brought with him his bow and arrows, those arrows tipped with the poison of the Lernaean hydra that made even the smallest wound fatal, and his club of olive wood, and his lion skin armor that no weapon could pierce. He was just one man among the gods, but he would prove to be the key to victory. The battle began when the giants reached the base of Mount Olympus and began their assault. They were too large to climb the mountain in any conventional sense, so they employed a different strategy, one that showed they were not mindless brutes but thinking beings capable of tactics. They began to stack mountains on top of each other, creating a ramp up to Olympus, piling Pelion on top of Ossa, adding more peaks until they had built a stairway that would reach the home of the gods. The effort was titanic, the word is fitting, for this was the kind of cosmic engineering that only beings of immense power could accomplish. The earth groaned under the strain, and the sound of mountains being torn from their roots and hurled into place echoed across the world. The gods did not wait for the giants to complete their mountain stairway. They attacked, descending from Olympus to meet their enemies on the slopes and foothills. The battle that followed was chaos in its purest form, a melee of gods and giants that spread across Thessaly and beyond, individual combats and mass conflicts happening simultaneously across a battlefield that covered hundreds of miles. Zeus led the charge, his thunderbolts lighting up the sky with continuous flashes of brilliance, each strike hitting with the force of a meteor. The thunder was constant, rolling across the landscape without pause, and the smell of ozone and burning stone filled the air. He targeted Porphyrion first, the second most powerful of the giants, raining lightning down upon him until the creature's skin was charred and smoking. But Porphyrion did not fall. The prophecy held true: divine power alone could not kill a giant, only wound and weaken. Zeus's lightning could hurt them, could burn them, could drive them back, but it could not finish them. That's where Heracles came in. Each time Zeus or one of the other gods managed to bring a giant to its knees, wounded and weakened by divine assault, Heracles would rush in with his bow drawn and put an arrow through the creature's heart or throat. The Hydra poison would do its work, spreading through the giant's body, and what the god's power could not accomplish alone, the combination of divine and mortal force achieved together. One by one, the giants began to fall, their enormous bodies crashing to the earth and creating new valleys where they landed. Athena fought with her usual combination of wisdom and warfare, never wasting motion, every strike calculated for maximum effect. She cast her spear at Enceladus, the fire-breathing giant, and though the spear wounded him grievously, he managed to flee, trying to escape across the sea. Athena, not content to let him go, tore the entire island of Sicily from its place. Some versions say this was before Zeus trapped Typhon there, others that it was after, meaning either the island was used twice or that Enceladus was piled on top of Typhon, and hurled it after the fleeing giant, crushing him beneath its weight. Even today, the Greeks said, you can see the evidence of Athena's throw in the volcanic activity of Mount Etna, the fire that still burns beneath Sicily coming from Enceladus's immortal breath. Poseidon pursued Polybotes across the Aegean Sea, the giant fleeing through water that should have been the sea god's ultimate advantage. But Polybotes was strong and swift, and he nearly escaped to land where he might have been safer. Poseidon, frustrated, broke off a portion of the island of Kos and threw it at the fleeing giant. The chunk of land crushed Polybotes into the sea, and it became the island of Nisyros, which still bears volcanic springs from the giant's heat trapped beneath it. Hephaestus, the craftsman god who was more at home in his forge than on the battlefield, nevertheless proved his worth in combat. He hurled molten metal and red-hot iron at the giant Mimas, burning him so severely that when Heracles finished him with an arrow, the giant's body had already been transformed into something barely recognizable, a mass of melted flesh and charred bone. Apollo and Artemis, the divine twins who were as skilled with the bow as any beings in creation, worked in perfect synchronization. They targeted Ephialtes, one of the largest giants, firing arrows from opposite directions simultaneously. Each arrow struck one of the giant's eyes at the exact same moment, blinding him completely. As Ephialtes staggered, confused and in agony, Heracles ended his suffering with a poison arrow through the throat. Dionysus, youngest of the major Olympians, fought with his characteristic unpredictability. He used his thyrsus, that staff wrapped with ivy and topped with a pine cone, as a weapon, and though it looked more ceremonial than martial, in the god's hands it struck with tremendous force. He beat the giant Eurytus to death with it, the wine god's divine strength more than sufficient to crush even a giant's skull, especially after Heracles had weakened him with arrows. Hecate, goddess of magic and the crossroads, wielded torches as weapons, burning the giant Clitius with supernatural fire that couldn't be extinguished by water or earth. The flames consumed him from within and without, and when he finally fell, his body continued to burn for days, the smoke rising into the sky like a pillar. Hera herself, queen of the gods and not typically depicted as a warrior, nevertheless fought with divine fury. When the giant Phoidos threatened her, she called upon her son Hephaestus to assist, and together, goddess and god working as mother and son, they brought the creature down, Hephaestus with his strength and Hera with her fierce determination. The battle raged for what might have been days or might have been years, the accounts differ, and perhaps time itself became flexible in the chaos of such cosmic conflict. The landscape of northern Greece was permanently altered by the fighting. Mountains were leveled, new ones thrust up, valleys carved out by the impacts of falling giants, rivers diverted from their courses, forests burned to ash. The very geography the ancient Greeks knew was shaped by this war, or so they believed, and they could point to specific features of the landscape and say, "This is where such and such giant fell," or "That mountain is made of the stones they threw." Alcyoneus, the leader of the giants and the mightiest of them all, proved the most difficult to defeat. Remember, he was immortal as long as he fought on his native soil, which meant that every time Heracles shot him with an arrow, every time Zeus blasted him with lightning, the giant would fall but then rise again, healed by contact with the earth. He was Gaia's ultimate champion, literally drawing power from his mother with every moment he stood upon her surface. Heracles, realizing the problem, employed strategy rather than just force. He waited for an opening when Alcyoneus was particularly weakened by divine assault, then rushed in and grabbed the giant. Using all his tremendous strength, the strength that had allowed him to hold up the sky during his labors, Heracles lifted Alcyoneus off the ground and began to carry him. The giant struggled, trying to break free, but Heracles held firm, his muscles straining with the effort. He carried Alcyoneus beyond the borders of his homeland, away from the soil that gave him immortality, and only when they had crossed into foreign territory did he finally let the giant drop. There, separated from the source of his power, Alcyoneus was vulnerable at last, and Heracles finished him with an arrow through the heart. With their leader fallen and most of their number dead or defeated, the remaining giants broke and fled. But the gods pursued them relentlessly, hunting them to the ends of the earth. Some were buried under volcanoes, others drowned in the deep ocean, still others simply vanished into the wild places of the world, their fates uncertain. The prophesied requirement held true throughout. Not a single giant fell to divine power alone, but always to the combination of god and mortal, always to Heracles working in concert with one or more of the Olympians. The victory of the gods over the giants was complete, but it came at a cost. The world had been ravaged by the conflict, landscapes destroyed, whole regions made uninhabitable by the violence. And more than that, the battle had demonstrated something troubling, that the gods were not invulnerable, that they could be threatened, that their rule was not absolute. They had needed help from a mortal to secure their victory, which meant that mortals were not irrelevant, not mere playthings for divine amusement, but essential partners in the maintenance of cosmic order. For the Greeks who told and retold this story, the gigantomachy represented several things at once. On one level, it was a story about the establishment of order over chaos, about civilization triumphing over wildness. The giants represented the old, savage world, the world before cities and laws, before agriculture and art. They were the forces of nature in their most violent form, earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, storms and floods, all the things that threatened human existence. The gods represented order, control, the idea that the world could be understood and managed, that chaos could be contained. But the story also had a political dimension. The Greeks lived in a world of constant conflict between civilized city-states and what they viewed as barbarian peoples beyond their borders. The gigantomachy could be read as a mythological version of this eternal conflict, with the gods representing Greek civilization and the giants representing the forces that threatened it from outside. Many temples featured sculptures of the gigantomachy on their walls, reminding worshippers that the battle between order and chaos was ongoing, that vigilance was necessary, that the forces of barbarism were always threatening to overwhelm civilization. There was also a generational aspect to the story that would have resonated with Greek audiences. The conflict between gods and giants mirrored other conflicts we've discussed, Uranus against Cronus, Cronus against Zeus. Each generation had to fight to establish its right to rule, had to prove itself superior to the generation that came before. This was a pattern that Greek families understood intimately, the tension between fathers and sons, the old struggling to maintain power while the young fought to establish themselves. But perhaps most importantly, the gigantomachy represented the idea that some battles are never truly finished, that the forces of chaos are never completely defeated. Yes, the giants were killed or imprisoned, but the earth remained, Gaia remained, and her resentment at Zeus's order remained. The volcanoes still erupted, earthquakes still shook the ground, storms still ravaged the seas. These were reminders that the giants' power had not been fully extinguished, that the old world still existed beneath the veneer of the new one, always threatening to break through. This is why the Greeks spoke of the war between gods and giants as eternal. It wasn't just one battle that happened once in mythological history and then was finished. It was an ongoing struggle, a perpetual conflict that defined the nature of reality itself. Every volcanic eruption was a giant stirring beneath his prison of stone. Every earthquake was Typhon struggling beneath Sicily or one of the defeated giants trying to break free. Every storm was a reminder that the wild forces of nature had not been tamed, only temporarily contained. The Greeks built temples on the sites where they believed giants had fallen, sanctifying these places, transforming them from monuments to chaos into shrines to order. The Parthenon in Athens, that most perfect expression of Greek civilization, featured a frieze depicting the gigantomachy, reminding every citizen who saw it that their city, their way of life, their entire civilization existed only because the gods had fought and won this battle, and that the battle would need to be fought again, in different forms, in every generation. There's something deeply human in this myth, despite its cosmic scale and its cast of divine beings. The idea that order is always under threat from chaos, that civilization is a fragile thing that must be defended, that the battle between what we might call our better nature and our more primitive impulses is never finally won, these are truths that transcend any particular culture or time period. The Greeks expressed these truths through stories of gods and giants, but the underlying reality is something every human society has grappled with in its own way. And there's another layer to consider, something about the relationship between humans and the divine. Heracles, the mortal hero who was essential to the gods' victory, represents humanity at its best, strong, brave, clever, capable of standing alongside gods as something approaching an equal. His necessity in the gigantomachy suggests that the gods, for all their power, are incomplete without mortals, that there's something humans possess that even divine beings lack. What is that quality? The Greeks might have said it was mortality itself, the fact that humans must die and know they must die, which gives them a courage and a desperation that immortals cannot truly understand. Or perhaps it was creativity, the ability to innovate and adapt that comes from being vulnerable and limited. Or maybe it was simply the willingness to take risks, to commit fully to a cause knowing that failure means oblivion, not just temporary defeat. Whatever the reason, the message is clear: humans matter in the cosmic scheme, not just as worshippers or victims, but as active participants. The gods needed Heracles. They could not have won without him. This is a remarkable thing for a religious mythology to admit, that the gods are not self-sufficient, that they require human cooperation to maintain their order. After the gigantomachy, there was peace for a time. Zeus ruled from Olympus, surrounded by his divine family, dispensing justice and watching over the world of mortals. The giants were defeated, the titans imprisoned, Typhon trapped beneath Sicily. But the Greek myths never promised eternal peace, only temporary respite. There were always new challenges, new conflicts, new threats to the order Zeus had established. Some of these came from within Olympus itself. The gods were not a perfectly harmonious family, they fought among themselves, took sides in mortal conflicts, pursued their own agendas sometimes at cross purposes to each other. Hera's jealousy of Zeus's affairs caused countless problems. Apollo and Artemis could be vengeful when disrespected. Ares reveled in war for its own sake. Aphrodite's manipulations of love and desire created chaos that even Zeus could not always control. And some threats came from outside. There were still monsters in the world, creatures that had escaped the various battles or been born afterward. The Nemean lion, the Lernaean hydra, the chimera, the sphinx, these and others had to be dealt with, usually by heroes like Heracles or Theseus or Perseus, mortals with divine blood who could bridge the gap between human and god. But perhaps the greatest threat, the one that hung over the entire Greek mythological system like a sword suspended by a thread, was the prophecy that Zeus's own son would eventually overthrow him, just as Zeus had overthrown Cronus and Cronus had overthrown Uranus. This pattern of succession through violence seemed to be woven into the fabric of divine reality, and Zeus knew it, feared it, took steps to prevent it that sometimes caused more problems than they solved. When he learned that the Titaness Metis, his first wife and advisor, was pregnant with a child who was prophesied to be greater than Zeus himself, he took the ultimate preventive measure. He swallowed Metis whole, just as his father had swallowed him and his siblings. But unlike Cronus's children, Metis and her unborn child were not preserved intact within Zeus's belly. Metis was absorbed, becoming part of Zeus himself, her wisdom literally internalized by the king of gods. And her child, Athena, was eventually born by emerging fully formed from Zeus's head, goddess of wisdom who was indeed greater than her father in some ways but who, because she was literally born from him, could never truly oppose him. This story, strange as it is, reveals Zeus's deep anxiety about his own position, his awareness that the pattern of divine succession suggests he too will eventually fall. But it also shows his intelligence. By swallowing Metis, he broke the pattern, or at least interrupted it. Athena could have been the child who overthrew him, but instead she became his greatest supporter, his wisest counselor, the one who most consistently worked to uphold his rule and the order he represented. The Greeks seemed to believe that Zeus's reign would last forever, or at least as long as the gods were worshipped. Unlike his father and grandfather, Zeus had learned from their mistakes. He was not as tyrannical as Uranus, not as paranoid as Cronus. He dispensed justice, at least sometimes. He was willing to share power, to delegate authority to other gods. He listened to counsel, particularly from Athena. He was not a perfect ruler, his affairs caused endless problems, his anger could be terrible, his pride sometimes led him into mistakes, but he was better than what came before, and that seemed to be enough. The eternal war between gods and giants, then, ended not with the complete annihilation of one side or the other, but with an uneasy balance, an equilibrium that was maintained by constant vigilance. The giants were defeated but not erased. The earth that birthed them still existed, still had power, still occasionally reminded the gods that their rule was not absolute. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, catastrophic storms, these were the giants' legacy, the ongoing expression of their resistance to Zeus's order. And in a way, this reflects the Greek understanding of reality better than any story of total victory would have. The Greeks lived in a world of earthquakes and volcanic activity. They knew firsthand that the earth beneath them was not stable, not fully controlled, not completely safe. They lived with the constant possibility of disaster, of nature asserting itself in ways that destroyed cities and killed thousands. The myth of the Gigantomachy gave them a framework for understanding these events, a way of seeing natural disasters not as random occurrences but as part of an ongoing cosmic drama. When the ground shook beneath their feet, they could think of Enceladus struggling beneath Sicily, or Alcyonius trying to break free from wherever he had been buried. When Mount Etna erupted, they could remember Typhon trapped beneath it, his immortal breath emerging as fire and smoke. These weren't just superstitious explanations, they were sophisticated ways of grappling with the reality of living in a dangerous, unpredictable world, of making meaning out of events that otherwise seemed meaningless and cruel. The temples the Greeks built, the sacrifices they made, the prayers they offered, all of these were, in a sense, their way of participating in the eternal war, of supporting the gods' efforts to maintain order against chaos. When they honored Zeus with sacrifices, they were reinforcing his power, helping him maintain the cosmic order. When they prayed to Poseidon before sailing, They were acknowledging his control over the seas but also implicitly reminding him of his duty to keep those seas navigable, to prevent chaos from overwhelming the careful balance that allowed human civilization to exist. This is one reason Greek religion was so focused on ritual and proper behavior rather than on belief or faith as we understand those terms. The gods needed human support to maintain their rule. The sacrifices, the festivals, the games, the temples, these were all ways humans contributed to the cosmic order, ways they helped the gods in their eternal struggle against the forces of chaos and disorder. And the heroes, those half-divine figures like Heracles who appeared regularly in Greek myth, were another crucial element in this ongoing battle. They were humanity's contribution to the divine side of the struggle, mortals who possessed enough divine nature to fight alongside gods but who retained enough humanity to understand mortal concerns and needs. They slew monsters, completed impossible tasks, defended cities, and in doing so, they were continuing the work that began with the Gigantomachy, pushing back the boundaries of chaos and expanding the realm of order and civilization. Every monster Heracles killed was a giant in miniature, a representative of the forces that threatened cosmic order. Every city Theseus protected or founded was a victory for civilization over barbarism. Every quest completed, every wrong righted, every tyrant overthrown, these were all battles in the eternal war, small-scale versions of the great cosmic conflict between gods and giants. The Greeks understood that this war would never truly end. As long as the earth existed, it would have power. As long as there were wild places beyond the boundaries of civilization, chaos would have a foothold. As long as human nature included violence and passion and unpredictability, the forces the giants represented would remain active in the world. The best that could be hoped for was an ongoing balance, a managed tension, not a final victory. This might seem pessimistic to us, raised as many of us were on stories with clear endings, on myths where good definitively triumphs over evil and everyone lives happily ever after. But there's a maturity in the Greek vision, an acceptance of reality as it is rather than as we might wish it to be. The world is dangerous. Order is precarious. Civilization is fragile. These are truths we still grapple with today, even if we no longer express them through myths of gods and giants. The greatest Greek tragedies understood this. When Sophocles wrote about Oedipus, he was exploring how even the wisest, best-intentioned people cannot escape fate, cannot fully control their own destiny. When Euripides wrote about Medea, he showed how passion and rage can overwhelm reason and civilization, turning even a loving mother into a monster. These weren't stories about gods and giants, but they were expressing the same fundamental truth, that chaos is always close, that the veneer of civilization is thin, that we are all participants in an eternal struggle that we cannot finally win, only continue to fight. But if this sounds dark, it shouldn't. There's also something deeply hopeful in the Greek vision, something that emerges from their acceptance of reality's harshness. If the war is eternal, then defeat is never final either. Every setback can be overcome. Every disaster can be survived. The earth might shake, volcanoes might erupt, giants might stir beneath their prisons of stone, but the gods still rule from Olympus, heroes still arise to defend civilization, humans still build and create and persist. The Gigantomachy, in this reading, becomes a story about resilience, about the refusal to give up even in the face of overwhelming opposition. The gods were outnumbered by the giants. They needed help from a mortal. Victory was not certain. But they fought anyway, and they won, and they established an order that, while imperfect and always threatened, was nevertheless real and worth defending. This is the lesson the Greeks took from the eternal war between gods and giants, not that we can defeat chaos forever, but that we can fight it today, in this moment, and that the fight itself is meaningful, is heroic, is what defines us as beings capable of choosing order over disorder, civilization over savagery, meaning over meaninglessness. As we come toward the close of this long, gentle exploration of ancient conflict, it's worth reflecting on why these stories still matter, why we're still telling them thousands of years after the Greeks who created them have vanished. The literal belief in Zeus and the Olympians has long since faded, replaced by other religions, other philosophies, other ways of understanding the world. But the stories remain, and they remain because they speak to something timeless in human experience. We all face our own giants, not literal beings with serpent legs rising from the earth, but challenges that seem insurmountable, forces that threaten to overwhelm us, moments when chaos seems ready to triumph over the order we've tried to establish in our lives. These might be personal struggles, illness, loss, failure, fear. They might be social, injustice, conflict, the breakdown of community. They might be existential. The simple fact of mortality, the knowledge that everything we build will eventually crumble, that entropy always increases, that chaos is the universe's natural state and order the temporary exception. The myth of the gigantomachy tells us that these struggles are not new, that humans have always faced them, that our ancestors thousands of years ago felt the same fears and doubts we feel. But it also tells us that victory is possible, that even when the odds seem overwhelming, even when divine power alone is insufficient, the combination of whatever strength we can muster, divine or otherwise, with human courage and ingenuity can prevail. Heracles, in the myth, is essential not because he's stronger than the gods, he's not, but because he brings something they lack, something fundamentally human. His mortality makes him desperate in a way immortals cannot be. His limited time means he must act now, must commit fully, must risk everything because he has everything to lose. The gods can afford to be patient, to wait, to withdraw and regroup. Heracles cannot. He must fight as if this battle is his last, because any battle might be his last. And perhaps that's the secret the myth is trying to tell us, that our limitations, our mortality, our vulnerability are not weaknesses but strengths, that they give us a urgency and a commitment that beings without those limitations cannot possess. The gods needed Heracles not despite his humanity but because of it. We are all Heracles, in a sense, fighting alongside forces larger than ourselves against obstacles that seem unconquerable. The giants we face might be different from the ones in the myth, but the struggle is the same, and the solution is the same. We must fight anyway, with everything we have, in partnership with whatever powers we can muster, knowing that victory is possible even if it's not guaranteed. The Greeks built their civilization in a harsh land, on rocky soil where farming was difficult, surrounded by the sea that could as easily destroy as sustain, in the shadow of mountains that erupted and earth that shook without warning. They had every reason to give up, to decide that the struggle was too hard, that chaos would always win. But they didn't. They built cities, developed philosophy and drama and democracy, created art and literature that still moves us millennia later. They fought their own gigantomachy, and while they didn't win forever, no civilization does, they won for long enough to give us the stories, the wisdom, the example of what human beings can achieve when they refuse to surrender to chaos. So as we conclude this journey through ancient myth, as the story winds down like a river reaching the sea, take with you this understanding: the war between order and chaos is eternal, yes, but that means it's also ongoing, happening now, in this moment, in your life and mine. We are all participants, whether we realize it or not. Every act of creation is a blow against chaos. Every moment of kindness or courage or persistence is a victory for order. Every time we choose to build rather than destroy, to understand rather than condemn, to hope rather than despair, we are fighting alongside the gods against the giants. We are Heracles with our poison arrows. We are making the choice that defines us as human. The giants will never be finally defeated. The earth will always shake. Storms will always threaten. Chaos will always lurk at the boundaries of order, waiting for a chance to break through. But the gods still rule from Olympus, by which we mean that order is still possible, that meaning can still be made, that civilization still stands despite everything arrayed against it. And we, you and I, listening to this story in the quiet of night, connected across time to those ancient Greeks who first told it, We are still here, still fighting, still building, still believing that the struggle is worthwhile even knowing it never ends. That persistence, that refusal to surrender, that determination to create order out of chaos even for a moment, that is the true victory, the one the giants can never take from us, the triumph that echoes down through the ages from the slopes of Olympus to wherever you are right now, listening to these words. The war is eternal. But so is the fight. And in the fighting, we find our meaning, our purpose, our place in the great story that connects us to everyone who came before and everyone who will come after. The gods and giants may be myth, but the battle they represent is as real as your heartbeat, as constant as your breath, as meaningful as anything humans have ever done or ever will do. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of this ancient story, that tomorrow you will wake and continue the fight, that your efforts matter in ways large and small, that order exists because beings like you choose to create it, to defend it, to believe in it despite all evidence that chaos should prevail. The Greeks whispered these truths to their children as they fell asleep, and now I whisper them to you, across the centuries, across the dark. You are strong enough, brave enough, human enough to face whatever giants arise in your path. The stars still will overhead as they did when Zeus first threw his thunderbolts. The earth still turns beneath us as it did when the giants rose to challenge the gods. And we still tell stories in the darkness, stories that connect us to our ancestors and our descendants, stories that remind us who we are and what we're capable of when we refuse to give up, when we stand together against the forces that would undo us, when we choose order over chaos, light over darkness, hope over despair. The eternal war continues. Rest now. Tomorrow, you'll take up your place in it once more, as humans have always done, as humans will always do, until the last story is told and the last star goes dark. But that moment is far away, impossibly distant, and between now and then lies an infinity of battles to be fought, victories to be won, moments of grace and courage that echo the ancient conflict between gods and giants, that prove the pattern established then still holds true, that chaos can be contained, that order can prevail, that meaning triumphs over meaninglessness, at least for a time, and that time is all we have, all we need, all we've ever had. Close your eyes now. Let these ancient truths settle into your bones like wisdom, like strength, like the knowledge that you are part of something vast and ongoing, something that began before you were born and will continue after you're gone, something that gives purpose to the struggle and meaning to the fight. The gods and giants may be sleeping now, but their war lives on in every choice we make, every challenge we face, every victory we claim against the odds. And in the morning, when you wake, remember, you are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, more capable than you imagine. You carry within you the legacy of every human who ever faced impossible odds and fought anyway, who stood against chaos and refused to yield, who built and created and loved in the face of a universe that cares nothing for human efforts. That is the gift the Greeks gave us, wrapped in stories of gods and giants, not the certainty of victory, but the nobility of the fight. Not the promise of eternal order, but the invitation to create temporary order and to defend it for as long as we can. Not an escape from the eternal war, but the honor of participating in it, of matching, of choosing sides and standing firm. The story ends here, but the war goes on. Sleep well, brave listener. Dream of gods and giants, of heroes and monsters, of battles won and struggles continuing. And when you wake, carry these ancient truths into your day. The fight is eternal, but so are we, rising each morning to face it anew, together, as humans have always done. Good night. The gods watch over you. The heroes walk beside you. And tomorrow, the eternal war continues, with you in it, fighting for all that matters, for all that's good, for all that makes this precarious order worth defending. Rest now. The giants are sleeping. So should you. Tomorrow is another day in the eternal war, and you'll need your strength. But tonight, in this moment, there is peace, there is quiet, there is the gentle knowledge that you are part of something ancient and ongoing and impossibly important. Sleep well, kind listener. Until we meet again in another story, in another journey through the peaceful haven of history. Sleep well.